right, many of us in this room are 17 and 18 years old. And if we were to all endure the foster care system, over half of us would have already experienced an arrest, a conviction, or an overnight stay at a correctional facility. Within 2 years of leaving foster care, over 25% of us will come into contact with the criminal justice system. And in all, 90% of children who go through the foster care system come into contact with the criminal justice system before leaving child welfare. If you know me, you likely know that I love kids, and I've recently discovered that one day I want to foster, but these numbers really freak me out. So, as I was looking into the foster care system and the research that comes with it, I discovered a distinguishingly strong yet seemingly disregarded pipeline, and that is the pipeline from the foster care system to the criminal justice system. It is undeniably evident that there is a funneling network of foster children into crime and incarceration, and I believe it is our duty as Christians to not only acknowledge this pipeline, which is more than already what most of the population is doing, but also discover the root of it and put an end to it. So there was very limited information available to the public, which is an issue in and of itself. But I was able to distinguish three factors that play a major role in supporting this pipeline and feeding these children into crime. And that would be poor housing situations, ill-equipped caretakers, and inadequate mental health services for children. The main function of the foster care system is to provide children in need with a safe and nurturing temporary home. Yet that is the very main issue with the system. Its main issue, its most detrimental issue with the system revolves around the placement and housing of children. Due to a recent shortage in available foster homes, children have been placed in juvenile detention facilities. These children are growing up in a jail cell. Growing up in such a setting stimulates a sense of dependence on the criminal justice system, and these children are naturally acclimated to this obstructive, ruthless environment. After spending their childhood and adolescent years in a jail cell, which are the years that are most cognitive to your social development skills, or most crucial to your cognitive and social development skills, these children are put at a much higher risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system. Group homes, on the other hand, are a much more common alternative to placing children when there is a shortage of foster homes. And while they are a step up from detention facilities, they still issue very severe prison-like conditions. Group homes house an average of 5 to 10 children in one group home, and they all come from different backgrounds, ages, and both genders. Now, one staff member is on duty per 2 children at all times. And the harsh reality is that it is very common for these staff members to physically, emotionally, and sexually abuse these children that they are caring for. And it is also likely that the older foster children abuse the younger ones in the same way. It is proven that the children who grow up in group homes are at a much higher risk of committing crimes compared to those who grow up in foster homes, and this is likely because of peer influence. Children are more likely to sell drugs and become involved in gangs after watching their peers in the group home involve themselves in similar activities. There's a lack of intentional and individual care in a group home, and the care that is being provided is not adequate. And so this leads children to act out in socially inappropriate ways and therefore commit crimes. Most children who enter the foster care system are placed with non-relative foster parents in a typical foster home. Now, this is the ideal living situation for foster children. However, there are downsides as well. The reality is that many children are frequently moved from home to home for a variety of reasons. Within the first year of care, over 1/3 of children are moved at least 2 times. This perpetual starting over process hinders children from building and maintaining sustainable relationships with others, whether that be with their foster parents, foster siblings, or even teachers and classmates if they're being moved from school to school. In one study, 17 pairs of foster parents were interviewed, 13 of which admitted to calling the police, I'm getting ahead of myself here. 90% of youth who receive 5 different placements will get involved with the criminal justice system. I'm going to say that again. 90% of children who receive 5 different placements will come into contact with the criminal justice system. These children often adopt a sense of disregard and unaccountability because they believe that these foster parents that they're with don't really have that weighty of an authority with them, that they'll only be with them for a short period of time, and that second part is oftentimes true. It is evident that the more a child is moved from home to home, the more numb they become emotionally, and therefore they are more likely to commit crimes. This correspondence has led researchers to explore the caretaker's role in this pipeline. Many actually believe that the root of this pipeline from the foster care system to the criminal justice system heavily relies on the actions of ill-equipped caretakers. Oftentimes, foster parents are unaware of how to handle simple behavioral discrepancies with foster children, and so they opt for calling law enforcement. This was the study I was getting ahead of myself for. 17 pairs of foster parents were interviewed, 13 of which admitted to calling the police at least once to handle a behavioral discrepancy with their foster child. Opting for law enforcement intervention further arouses feelings of bitterness within the child because there is a lack of grace and constructive criticism from their caregivers. Instead of working with the child to determine what steps need to be taken next to correct their behavior, caretakers frequently call the police because it is simply the easiest option for them, or they're not equipped to handle such situations. In calling the police, caretakers not only surrender the opportunity to deepen their relationship with their foster child, but they also put that child at a much higher risk of committing crimes in the future. Once a child starts to build a criminal record, just like the dependency from growing up in a group home, they begin to form a reliance on the criminal justice system and that law enforcement in their life in handling their behavioral issues. While it is crucial that the caretakers are fully equipped to handle necessary behavioral issues, many foster children are in need of professional help. 80% of foster children suffer from at least one mental disorder. However, only 33% of those children are receiving the necessary medication. Mental health services that are available to foster children are often inadequate and inconsistent, and this goes hand in hand with being moved from home to home. They aren't able to, say, keep up with the same therapist if they're out of range, certain examples like that. Foster children experience a wide range of mental disorders, but some of the most common disorders diagnosed include anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD, eating disorders, and oppositional defiant disorder. In many cases, foster children are removed from their biological parents due to maltreatment, neglect, and abuse, which likely means that they have experienced some form of physical, emotional, or psychological trauma. And the effects of such trauma reveal themselves in a multitude of ways. However, the children who suffer from PTSD specifically are much more likely to be violent and defiant, which causes them to commit crimes. This causes them to rebel, and without proper support and treatment and diagnoses of these mental disorders, children in foster care have a really difficult time processing, understanding, and recovering from the circumstances that they are put in the foster care system for, which again can cause them to act out in socially inappropriate ways. So, given the 3 main factors that support this pipeline, what do we do? In order to prevent the placement of children in group homes and detention facilities, it's evident that there needs to be an addition of foster homes available. So how do we do that? Well, Matthew 9:37 refers to the verse explaining that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And at first, I knew I liked this verse, but I didn't know exactly how to connect it. But then it kind of clicked for me that the harvest is plentiful in that there are several foster children who are in need of a foster home, one with adequate parents, parents that are adequately trained, that is, to handle their issues. In many cases, there are plenty of children in need of that foster home, but there are not enough people willing to provide that home. And that is where we as a church have failed to provide that home for those children. We must remember that we are laborers of the Lord. We are kingdom laborers, and we have not been saved and set apart to sit idly, but to be a kingdom laborer for his glory. We must also instill more adequate training for caretakers and more accessible, reliable mental health services for children. We would be providing a more comfortable, stable, and loving environment for foster children if we better equipped caretakers and acknowledged and treated children's mental health disorders. James reminds us here that caring for orphans is simply a part of Christianity. It is a service that points to a pure and genuine religion. It is our responsibility to do everything that we can to break this pipeline. After I've worked to, distinguish these main factors that support it, we need to put an end to it and remember our position as Christians.
Thank you. Want to open it to our guests first. You got any questions or feedback around the change?
Is there training for foster parents? Like whenever they first sign up, do they go through training classes?
Yes, ma'am. I believe there is a pretty rigorous process that they go through, but it's obvious that it must not be rigorous enough if they aren't able to handle, you know, generic behavioral issues that are probably common with the mental disorders that come into the foster care system. That's a good question.
I have a couple questions.
Okay.
Well, first of all, well done.
Thank you.
First question, do you have a chance to talk to people who are actively fostering?
So
What was that interaction like?
I really planned. I had several people in mind that I wanted to talk to. When I originally started researching the foster care system, I hadn't decided to do the pipeline. I just decided to research the negative sides of it. And then it was way too broad and there was so much information. And so I narrowed it down to this. And I didn't know anybody personally that dealt with the criminal justice side of it. Three people that I was planning on talking to, they all were involved in the foster care or dealing with foster children, but they couldn't really relate to the criminal side of it. So it didn't work well, but I had hoped to.
That's obviously like a very significant conversation, and I think for Christians as well. As you pointed out in James, as well as literally all over the Old Testament. I mean, every other verse in the prophets is about taking care of widows and orphans.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus' first words in Luke about what he came to do were he had good news for the poor, and the poor was not necessarily somebody who just was lacking money, but found themselves in a really difficult position. So the words of Jesus are actually more pertinent to orphans and widows than they are to people like me,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest. And so, well done. I mean, I just think it's really, really good job. The other question I have is, are there other, obviously this is the state who runs the foster care system, correct? Are there any other institutions outside of the state who use foster care? Like, does Miracle Hill do foster care?
That's a great question. I have not looked into organizations that kind of help children in that way. I have not looked into that, but that's a really good question.
If I remember right, the church I attend does a lot with foster care, and they used to partner specifically with, I think it is Miracle Hill Fostering. They run their own kind of system. They have a shocking statistic, a way to curb and end the foster care system in South Carolina. Are you aware of how they could end the foster care system?
No, sir.
One person in every church in South Carolina took a foster child, the foster care system would evaporate.
Wow.
That's all it takes, is one person from each church in South Carolina to do that. that we would probably have a very different conversation on our hands on this. Not to say that Christians don't already have some of those issues. I'm sure Christians are absolutely a part of those
Right.
statistics and quantities and being the funnel and pipeline. But yeah, well done.
Thank you.
So to that point, I don't want to leave that, because something you said it in the paper and here, and it was kind of, I don't know, it caught my attention, was it's not just that the church is valuable in terms of numbers. Like it really is a numbers game, right? Like we got X amount of kids. We know how many kids in this particular state anyways that are in the foster care system. You do the math of how many Christians we've got running around that could take one of those kids in. We could handle this problem.
Right.
We could take care of this problem. But also something that you said I don't hear enough people talking about is it's not just that the church is a possible source for the quantity issue, how many foster homes we have, but also the quality of it.
Right.
Because churches are really good places where you can go and get training for stuff. I know my church on a regular basis is having training sessions on how do you evangelize people, how do you help the homeless, how do you do this or the other, and it's a constant, like, here are these courses, these classes that you can take. And I know our church has done a little bit with foster care where it's like, if you want to, we want to help you become a foster care family or whatever, but also like in terms of the quality of the training. It seems like churches should, at least, I know there's always Christians have as many problems as other people do, unfortunately, but at least a church would be a good place where it's not just that we have the numbers, we also have a source of the kind of training that you could receive.
Right.
That goes back to Mrs. Theodore's question, like it seems like there's a big training problem here that foster families, they might be trained, but apparently not in the right way.
Right.
Right. So that's something that's really interesting, and I think it's a really important thread to pull at. I wanted to ask about, so maybe this is kind of back to the other question. These group homes.
Yes.
Who do you know anything about those? Like who runs them? Like what are those? I'm assuming it's not just some guy saying, "Hey, I got a big house."
Right. No, they are. I believe they are state. What's the word? Institution. Yeah. The state runs them,
Okay.
but as far as the workers, I think that they go through the same process as foster parents or those who want to be foster parents. But I just wonder how different it would be if parents, especially, were able to call the church when they have a behavioral issue and be like, how do I do this? Instead of just calling the police, like you were saying. But as far as how they're set up, I believe it is a state thing, especially when there's a shortage.
Yeah.
You know.
Another thing I think is really interesting, like you use the term pipeline. I think that's what it is. But the way pipelines work, and this is okay. So all the rest of you, like this, it's so awesome doing all these projects with y'all because every single one of you have something that the rest of us need to hear, right? Every single one of you have a project that the rest of us need. And one of the things that I think we need to hear is that so many of these criminal justice issues are not because these kids live a life of crime. They live a life of crime because of the hand that they've been dealt. Is this making sense? When Ellis, Jayne, and I were trying to figure out, like, you're right, like it's an overwhelming problem. It's a big problem. So we try to narrow it down a little bit. And we were talking, and when several years ago, a ministry that I was a part of that I loved dearly was going to a juvenile detention center and talking with kids and hanging out with kids. We went on a weekly basis, sometimes multiple times a week, played ball with these guys, told them about Jesus, studied the Bible with them. It was awesome. Changed my life. And one of the things that just hit me like a ton of bricks was probably about a third of the guys that were in there had never broken a law of any sort. They'd never broken curfew. They'd never gotten in a fight at school. They were kids who didn't know their biological parent, had no connection with their biological parents. So in the foster care system, nobody wants a teenage boy introduced to their house. And so, hey, the state already runs this place where there's rooms and food every day. And so they get put into a detention center by default. They never broken any laws, but here they are in the detention center. But you better believe a teenage boy in that environment is going to learn how to break the law at some point. He's going to learn how to get in a fight. He's going to learn how to live that life. And by the time the detention center is done with him, that's the only life that kid knows. This is the problem. This is the issue, that because there was no other place for that kid to go, they've got put in this pipeline that is going to take them to a place that they also have no choice over them. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all about personal responsibility and accountability, but when you see a 10-year-old kid go in as an innocent 10-year-old kid and come out a 16-year-old criminal, something has been done to that child. Y'all following this? Okay. This is the nature of the problem that we're dealing with. And then when we talk about the trauma thing, another thing that I love that you said it really well on your paper, that these kids, and I don't know if like you even meant to say this explicitly, these kids have experienced trauma just by merit of being in their situation. Their situation is traumatic, right? So they get put into a foster care system that itself generates trauma, and then they get spit out on the other side with just multiplied issues, multiplied problems. So it just, the more you look at it, the more you realize the foster care system is just a big mental health crisis, for a big juvenile mental health crisis. It's kids, it's trauma, and until folks get trained in that way, and having known some of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my entire life, foster care families, and they get training, but it's training on like how to clean up after, how you're allowed to handle these kids and so on, and that there's just precious little training on how do you deal with a kid who has these disorders. It's almost like you almost want to be a mental health professional in order to take these kids in. Sorry for going on. This is this is one of those things where it's just like folks just aren't aware of the nature of the problem. Classmates, you got anything for Ellis, Jayne? Any questions that you're thinking about?
This might go to Miss Theodore's question, but like, can you explain more of what the procedure to become a foster parent is, and what like you think would like should the training be longer?
Yeah, I think Ms. Theodore hit it right on. I think that the ongoing training would be much more beneficial, being that phone call, or the church being that phone call instead of the police. But I believe that the process is pretty rigorous in that there's a bunch of qualifications that you have to meet, as where like age. I know there's like house requirements that like your house has to meet as far as like bathrooms and like rooms, but as far as like the training for these mental disorders, that's where I think we're lacking. Like Mr. Satterfield said, there's training in for, okay, what kind of clothes do you need, what food do you need, but not necessarily how to actually like raise this child to get out of the system that they were born into. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, like this is not like the reason why you keep hearing this term mental health crisis. I don't know if you like, we hear that term all the time. Like our culture is having a mental health crisis, and one of the reasons for that is because professionals in all fields, teachers. I'll speak from a teacher's perspective. I've been trained how to teach a subject. I've been trained how to write tests. I've been trained how to manage my classroom. I've been trained on all that stuff. What's lacking is I have students who have attention deficit disorders that frankly I had in school but was undiagnosed because they didn't talk about stuff like that back then. So I had to manage, I had to figure out ways to, and just made it through by the skin of my teeth, and so here I am, and now teaching students with those types of things. Basically, all I've got is personal experience. The problem is I don't want you to have to go through what I went through. That is trying to figure it out on your own. I would love to be able to help. Therefore, that's the training that I need, right? But on top of that, mental health issues. But on top of that, the idea that I've got students that are coming in depressed, anxious, and so on. And so we're all behind the curve on dealing with people with that. The mental health crisis is not that people have more mental health problems than they had in the past. It's that nobody knows how to deal with them. Nobody, like as an individual, I don't know how to cope with my own stuff, much less coach y'all on how to. And so this is the nature of of what we're dealing with here. There's training, but you got folks that with their own bunch of stuff that they're dealing with. Now they've got little kids that in their house that also have their own bundle of problems. So, um, yeah. What else you got?
Do you think if the pay was higher for foster families, like to foster a kid, do you think more people would do it? That's a tricky. It's a tricky situation because if the pay is like really good, then a lot of people are going to try and foster just for the money, and that's already a little bit of an issue. Is people becoming foster parents so that they get that monthly check, and then kind of disregard the child. So it's tricky because it would be more of an incentive, but you just want it to be an incentive for the right people. That's a good question.
It's great. Like I've heard horror stories of the foster care system. The rape, the abuse, the people that are just in it to get a paycheck, all the things that you mentioned. And yet, personally, every foster care situation I've ever seen, like I said, is the best people you'll ever meet. If I could run off a list of the kindest, sweetest, most capable people I've ever met, and the list of people who are also doing foster care, it's the same list. They're the same people. And I just that whenever somebody does a project like this, I'm always curious, like what in the world is happening out there that the problems are this bad. You can't argue with the numbers, you know, the statistics don't lie, but yeah, you want, and it's like the right people that you want doing it, they're not really going to care about how much. But again, it is a financial burden, right? So yeah, talk about tricky. That is tricky.
It is. I think I was telling you, Mrs. Chatterfield, that my doctor, his wife, I believe, is a mental doctor as well. So he's a pediatrician. She works with mental disorder. I don't know if she's a therapist or what, but anyways, they tried to foster and they just like would not get approved to foster, and it was just the weirdest thing because like who else would be more qualified than this couple, but they couldn't get through with it, and so they ended up kind of giving up on it because the system was so messed up to them. So there's so many issues within it, but yeah,
I know
it's
for
a
a lot
lot.
of families too. It's like some of our friends they struggle with infertility. They couldn't have kids for a long time, so they thought, hey, let's foster and eventually adopt. Well, in the process of fostering, they were able to have kids, and then it's like, okay, well, we have new babies. We're gonna take a break from fostering for a little bit. And it was the hardest decision for them because they loved fostering. It was like you said, like they were perfect for the situation. Um, but then also like there were kids that they could have had longer that they weren't able to for personal reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So also like when we're talking about the numbers game, I think it's important to note that like being a foster being a foster family is just going to be there are just so many variables involved. It's not like you can just get in the system and stay there.
Right.
And hence the moves that we talked about, like just moving these children all over the place. Yeah. Anything else?
Just out of curiosity, did you look into like the effect of like, 'cause I know some people on like social media just foster kids just for like views and stuff. Did you look into like the impact of that?
I honestly did not touch on social media much at all. I focused more on. I felt like that would be a whole nother like world of issues, but that's a good thing to look into. But I really didn't touch on the social media aspect of it. I assume it would be similar to what Grace was saying about like the paycheck and maybe getting that approval from other people, but not really doing anything to provide for the child. But that's a good question.